Before viewing video lessons, it is important to read the textbook using the learning guide as your turn-by-turn directions. Then use the learning guide to take organized notes in your own words with examples and pictures. Chapter 2, Psychological Research. We will begin by looking at the scientific approach to behavior. All science is governed by one basic assumption. This assumption is that events are governed by some sort of lawful order. So all science assumes that there is order to the universe, order to nature, and in the case of psychology, order to behavior. Science's main goal is to measure, understand, and control that particular phenomenon. So within the field of psychology, there are three main goals. The first goal is to measure and describe. Measuring and describing is more difficult in psychology than some other sciences. For example, in the world of geology, if I were given a rock and asked to determine what the rock was composed of, there'd be a number of different measurements and descriptions I would take. I might weigh the rock, I may look at the volume of the rock, I could look at the coloring, if there's any change in the rock if you get it wet, so I could put it in water. I could hit it with a hammer. I could light it on fire and see exactly what happens. In the case of people, it's not exactly that easy. So in the case of people, we're trying to measure and describe psychological phenomenon, and we don't have good tools that are readily available for that. For example, if I wanted to measure your anxiety level about our first test, I could not just pull out my handy-dandy anxiety tape measure and measure your anxiety level. So in the world of psychology, we have a lot of research that's just focusing on getting good measurement and good description of some of these phenomenon. Psychological research also attempts to understand and predict. So we try to make predictions about how variables are going to be related. The third goal is application and control. So this is the ultimate goal of science, is just not to understand how some variables are related or to predict how something will turn out, but we actually want to be able to control and manipulate psychology. We want to make psychology better for people. We want to prevent problems. We want to solve problems. And so some of our research focuses on application and control. Of course, application and control is dependent on understanding the phenomenon and having good measurements. So what are the steps in the scientific process? If you're like most students, you've been taking science classes since maybe the 3rd grade. So you've had science after science after science. Your textbook has 5 steps. I don't like the way the textbook displays this process, because in reality, science is a cyclical process. It's not set steps. The way I prefer to look at science is like this. All science flows in a circle so that it builds on itself over time. And so looking at science from more of a circular perspective helps you to see that there's not really a beginning and an end to science. It just continues on. We'll use this model throughout Chapter 2. Before we get into some of the details about the different steps in the scientific process, I have a question. This seems awfully complicated and like an awful lot of work. Why do we go to so much trouble? Isn't there an easier way to answer these questions we have about human behavior? While there may be easier and quicker ways to come up with some answer, any answer, those answers aren't reliable or valid. The advantage of the scientific approach is that it has great clarity and precision. As you will see when we talk about the research process, scientists try to be very clear on exactly what it is they mean. For example, if I say I'm studying anxiety, I define very clearly what that means. I also take very precise measurements. Some other advantages of the scientific approach are that over time, science is relatively intolerant of error. This is because scientists are skeptical. We don't just take one study's results. We have to have multiple studies. We question, we challenge, we test, we push, we repeat. Scientists also use empirical tests. This means we use tests based on systematic observations. Scientists also check each other's published work with replication. So if I see a particular study, I can repeat the study to see if I get the same results. Scientists can also use a technique called meta-analysis, and this is when we look at the results. This is when we look at the results of many studies, so that we draw conclusions not just from one experiment or one research study, but from many research studies. So that over time, science tends to be more accurate and dependable than any other form of decision making. So now that we've talked about how important this process is, we're going to be going through each step. Most scientists enter the process by having a general question or a problem. So this is just a general wondering, the same kind of general wondering that you have about people and animal behavior all the time. It's those little questions where you say, why did they do that? Or, oh, I can't believe I did that. What was going through my mind? So any of those kinds of questions might be a question that would enter a scientist into the scientific process. So we begin with that general question, and then our next step is to become educated. So what we need to do is look at theories and previous research. The theories we discussed in Chapter 1, but where would you find the previous research? This is the most important step in psychology because scientists report their findings, and these reports are then used in this step to inform new research. Without this, we would be constantly reinventing the wheel. So, we have a general question, and then we have gotten educated about that general question by determining what do we already know from the theories and from what previous research has found. Based on that education, we then create a testable hypothesis. This testable hypothesis is a very specific prediction, and we may base that prediction on that education. So the hypothesis will be something that builds on the previous research and is part of a particular theory or testing a piece of a particular theory. So the hypothesis, this testable, educated prediction, also must include something called operational definitions. Operational definitions are critical in all sciences, but particular to psychology. That is because operational definitions tell how you're going to measure or control each variable. As I mentioned before, in psychology, measurement is really important because there's not a standard measurement for anxiety, for example. And so in my study on anxiety, I have to be very specific about how I'm measuring that. Another study may measure it in a different manner. So we have to be really upfront and very clear about our operational definitions. The other important piece about the hypothesis is that I must be able to test it in an ethical manner. For example, Freud's theory, the psychoanalytic theory in Chapter 1, his theory suggested that abuse as a child would have a significant impact on adult behavior, and that adults who had been sexually abused, for example, as children, would have pretty severe psychological problems as adults. Now, in order to test that particular hypothesis experimentally, what I would have to do is get two sets of babies, divide them into the experimental group and the control group. The control group would be raised in a normal, loving environment, and the experimental group I would intentionally abuse. And then when they got to be about 30, I would test them, both groups, to see how many psychological disorders occurred in each group. That would be unethical for me to intentionally abuse a group of children, so my hypothesis would have to be altered so that it could be tested experimentally. So, in the research process, we begin with a question or a problem. Then we find out what we already know from theories and previous research based on reports. Then we can create testable hypotheses with operational definitions.